Mr. Andrew Yang. How are you? Good to see you, Mr. Yang. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. No, he did not bring $1,000 for every family.
You don't know that, Craig. You don't know that.
Here's the thing. So you're candidate number 8, as you might imagine. We're kind of in that delirious phase. So we apologize in advance. Just first of all, I want to start. Let's dig into your plan a little bit because you've got one of the more interesting proposals. And one of the aspects of your plan that I found most interesting is this tiered licensing, this gun licensing, 3 tiers. How would that work, and why is that such an integral part of your plan?
Well, if you think about our licensing system for motor vehicles, you have driver's license for passenger cars, and then you have commercial licenses if someone's driving a trailer truck or a semi. And it's in part because of the destructive power of the different vehicles. And in my mind, firearms are very analogous, where you have guns that, we should be licensing all guns. I mean, guns are obviously as deadly and destructive as vehicles, so for licensing motor vehicles, we should be licensing firearms. And then you have levels based upon the destructive capability of those firearms. I'm for banning military-style assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, but even among the firearms that are out there, there are different levels of destructive capacity. And so if you have a gun that requires a little bit more sophistication and training, then you should know that if someone's going to own that gun, that they've passed various tests to get a license for that weapon, if those weapons are permitted.
So would this be a licensing program that's run at the federal level? Is this something that's run at the state level?
Well, again, it's analogous to what we do with motor vehicles. So there are both federal and state regulations that affect motor vehicles, but a lot of the requirements are at the federal level, and then the states implement them and sometimes layer on top of them. In this case, you would start with federal regulation, and then the states would implement and then add on as they saw fit.
Centerpiece of your campaign is, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, is economic insecurity. One of the things you've talked about is providing every family in this country with $1,000 every month to help close the gap, if you will, to a certain extent. Talk to me a little bit about the correlation between economic insecurity and gun violence as you see it.
Thank you for that. And as candidate number 9, I do want to
talk
talk about 8. Sorry about that. 8 of 9, probably. Is there someone after me?
Yeah, 9. They're 9.
Most of the candidates that have been sitting in this seat right here, and I agree on most of the relevant common sense gun safety laws that we should implement. I think most Democrats agree that we need to do much more in that direction. But to Craig's question, I think that there's this whole series of events that leads to gun violence, and we need to attack every link in the chain. And my flagship proposal that if you've heard anything about me, you know I want to give every American $1,000 a month. And there are many reasons why I'm certain we should do this, but it even impacts the underlying root causes of gun violence. Because if you look at the series of events that lead to gun violence, what are we talking about? We're talking about the composition and stress levels in homes, in the family. You're talking about what's happening in our school systems, whether when people show up to schools, one of my boys is on the autism spectrum, so he's neurologically atypical. And we have many, many kids who are showing up to schools that are not actually made to accommodate them. Or people of different neurological profiles. You have one teacher for 25 or 30 kids. And we know that more than 96% of the eventual shooters are boys. So we have boys who are neurologically atypical or have ADHD showing up to school systems that are not designed to accommodate them. And they become marginalized. They sometimes see themselves as deeply alienated. And in most all those cases, obviously, they're not going to become a shooter. But in a rare, tragic case, they do become a shooter. So if you have $1,000 a month in the hands of every adult and every family, that actually amplifies the level of resources that are available to make that child stronger, both in the home and when they get to school. It amplifies the level of resources available in the school system to be able to accommodate kids of different learning profiles. The end of this chain, obviously the ones we need to focus on because they're the most direct, which is access to the firearm and then the decision to use the firearm. And those are things we need to attack, but I believe we need to try and attack the root causes of this as well, because the fact is, even if we get common sense gun laws across the finish line, which after we break the stranglehold of the NRA and our legislature, I believe we can do. But then we're going to wake up the next morning and we know there's still going to be gun violence in our communities. We're going to be struggling with this for generations, unfortunately. And so we need to try and attack the root causes as well as the last links in the chain.
There was a moment in Iowa that I saw where you were visibly moved after hearing from a woman who lost her daughter to a stray bullet, and it reminded you of your kids. As you have crisscrossed this country running for president, the stories like that, men and women and families who've lost sons and daughters and mothers and fathers to gun violence, how have those stories affected you on a personal level?
You can't help but be touched when you meet a survivor of gun violence, and in that case, as a parent who's on the road a lot, putting myself in the shoes of a parent who literally lost a child in front of them, it was heartbreaking. Thinking about it even now, it's very human. I mean, campaigning for president is very human. Gun violence is very human. And one of the stats I'm sure that's come up earlier today is that almost 2/3 of the victims of gun violence are the owners themselves, where oftentimes you have, and I said this in Iowa, if we all had a self-destruct button on our wrist where you just press it and you disappear, a lot of us probably would have pressed that button at some point in our lives. You'd have some moment of weakness or humiliation or something, and then you just be like, poof, and you're gone. But of course, that button doesn't exist, thank goodness. And then you would regret the decision a moment later. Now, what's happening with gun owners, unfortunately, is they have that moment of catastrophic weakness, but then they make an irreversible and tragic decision that they would have regretted a moment later. And so the human toll that this is taking, I mean, clearly, we're here, I believe, discussing gun violence systemically, where as a public, we should not fear to have our kids in school or go shopping or be out in a public place and fear gun violence. But we also need to recognize the fact that in many cases, the shooters become victims themselves in various ways. And a lot of attacking this problem is trying to make people stronger and more resistant to that catastrophic, tragic, irreversible decision.
There seems to be growing support for this idea of treating gun violence as a public health emergency.
Which it clearly is. And the fact that we're not treating it as such is clearly because the gun lobby has kept us from putting the resources in place to study it appropriately. I mean, we all know you can't make progress on an issue if you don't have the right measurements, you don't know what the baseline is. I mean, tens of thousands of Americans are dying every period. This is clearly a public health epidemic.
If we treated it as such, how would that look? How would that change our approach from a policy standpoint?
And this is one reason why the lobbyists are fighting it. So I just want to talk about the lobbyists for just a moment. At this point, as you said, Craig, 90% of Americans agree on many of these common sense gun laws, and we're not getting them across the finish line. So our legislature now does not reflect the will of the people. And why is that? It's because they're scared of the NRA, they're scared of the gun lobby, they're held hostage by this corporate money. It's very difficult to get that corporate money out of politics. It's going to just try and creep its way back in. So to me, the best solution is to flush the money out with people-powered money. And what do I mean by that? I've been running for president for a little while now, and the sad truth is that the people are here and the money's over here. And if you're a legislator, then you start getting attracted to the money over time because it's easier to count and measure, and they can give you a job afterwards, and the food is better. Like that you just naturally end up just gravitating towards the money. And what we have to do is we have to make the will of the people and the source of money the same thing. And the way we do that is by giving every American voter, adult, 100 democracy dollars that you can then give to any candidate or campaign or cause, and then we could flush out the lobbyist money by a factor of 8 to 1. So if I get 10,000 Americans who give me $100 each in this democracy dollars voucher, I get $1 million. And then when the NRA lobbyist or the gun lobby comes along and says, I'm going to give you $100,000 to bury this legislation, you say, I don't care about your $100,000. I'm getting $1 million from the people. That's how we override the stranglehold. We break the stranglehold that the NRA and the gun lobbies have over our laws. As someone who's studied a lot of these economic problems, this is called an externality, where if you have, and this is a very tragic human externality, where if someone kills someone with a gun, or if it's a mass shooting, what happens to the gun company's stocks the next day? They go up. That's right. So when there's a mass shooting, people run out and buy guns because they're afraid that legislation is coming, and so gun sales go up. And this is the most perverse, nasty set of incentives you can imagine. Because if you're a gun manufacturer, you actually profit when there's a mass shooting. This is called an externality, like this tragedy. And so ideally, you would have the gun companies themselves have to pay a fine anytime their product is used to kill an American. And then the incentives would be reversed very quickly, because if my firearm, my product gets used in a mass shooting, then all of a sudden I get hit with a $10 million fine the next day. Then do you think I might be more open to some legislation that helps bring the casualty rate down? And so this is true in many aspects of American life. It's true for pollution as well. Like if I pollute, then like everyone pays and I don't pay. And one of the big things we have to correct as a country is to bring the tragedies and the externalities into the corporate balance sheet. Because they're going to do what they think is in their financial best interest. We have to make it in their financial best interest to make us safer.
We're going to turn to the audience now for just a couple of questions. And of course, we're having this conversation one day after the 2-year anniversary of the worst shooting in the history of our country. And one of the survivors of that shooting is with us. Her name is Heather Goose. She survived that Route 91 shooting here in Las Vegas. There she is. Here's Heather. Heather, so good to see you again. And the floor is yours.
Hi there. So just a little background on me. October 1st, 2017, I was working as a bartender at the Route 91 Harvest Festival. 3 days, having a great time. You know, just fun country music, gorgeous weather, amazing drinks made by me. You know, a little after 10 o'clock on day 3, over 22,000 people's lives changed. I went from making Tito's and lemonades and Long Island iced teas to having my finger inside the back of a complete stranger's head. I literally was plugging the bullet hole of a 44-year-old man who would never see another concert. And while I was still covered in his blood, I then held the hand of a 23-year-old boy who was never going to smile, dance, or ever see his girlfriend again. I sat with his body for 5 hours. I answered his phone, and I had to tell his mom that her only child was dead. The shooter that night was able to acquire an arsenal of assault weapons and bump stocks, whether they be from online or walking into a store and buying 7, 8, 9, 10 guns at the same exact time. He killed 58 people. He shot 422. He injured thousands, and mentally, tens of thousands of us will never be the same. What can we do, and what can you do to make such a tragedy like this never happen again?
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Heather. Let's give her a round of applause. We need to make it much, much harder to get your hands on weapons that can kill large numbers of Americans in a very short period of time. And we also need to have licensing and an inventory system where if someone buys an arsenal, as the Las Vegas shooter does, you have to ask yourself, it's like, what is the legitimate purpose why someone would buy thousands of rounds of ammunition and an entire arsenal for personal use? Like, can one imagine an appropriate rationale for accruing that kind of arsenal? And this is where some of the enhanced, in my mind, and this can be packaged something that's like, look, like with great power comes great responsibility. If for some reason you want to get your hands on these weapons, like we need to actually dig into what the heck is going on. 3% of Americans own 50% of the guns in this country. So you're talking about a very concentrated rate of gun ownership among a relatively small number of Americans. So to me, if you're one of those Americans who has access to a very high number of guns, then we need to know who you are, what you're doing, and why you have this arsenal, so that if someone has murderous intent, then we'd prevent them from getting access to these guns. And the Las Vegas shooter is the toughest case because he did not have a ton of historic red flags or a bunch of other things that might have brought him to the attention of the authorities. It's one reason why this case is, to me, one of the most shocking or horrifying. A very secondary element is that he was able to get access to a perch that he used to kill large numbers of Americans in like an elevated structure. And unfortunately, we're at a point in our society where if you operate a hotel casino, then you probably should have some sort of measures to make sure that you can't, because I'm sure other people thought the same thing. It's like, how the heck do you get an arsenal into your hotel room? You know what I mean? It's like you like literally walk in with like cases and cases of ammunition. And so if you are a large scale establishment, you should have some degree of countermeasures to someone literally importing an arsenal onto your premises.
Mr. Yang, just taking a step further here, let's just say we live in a country where the government does know who has what kinds of guns and how many guns and what kinds of ammunition, how much ammunition. What do we do with that information?
Well, one thing we should have is a perpetual evergreen buyback to try and decrease the supply of these weapons and say, look, we think it's a public good if we decrease the supply, and so let's get these guns off your hands. And so if you know who the owners are, and then you can try and reduce the supply with them. And in some cases, for example, let's say an owner passes and there's this whole inventory of guns, and then their estate or the kids like have this stockpile, and we can get hopefully that stockpile into public hands and either destroy them or make sure that they're not dangerous in any way. Another thing that I proposed that we can do is we can actually make the guns themselves safer by enhancing them with technology that makes it so that only the owner can fire them. So this way, because a lot of gun owners have kids, and so you can actually equip a gun with handprint technology, not fingerprint, but it's actually mapped to like the size of your palm and where the pressure is from, so that only the owner can fire it. And gun owners would appreciate this because then if their 16-year-old son gets a hold of the gun, they can't do anything with it. So if you know who owns the guns, then you can actually take measures to either buy back the guns or make the guns safer in a way that you can't if you don't know where the guns are.
Heather, thank you, by the way. Thank you, Heather. Let's turn for a moment to Taylor Martin and Jesse Holmes. Taylor and Jesse are both 17-year-old high school students. There they are. Where do you go to school?
Hi. We go to school at Thurgood Marshall in D.C. We are two leaders from Pathways to Power. We lost two of our peers, Zaire Kelly and Paris Brown, due to gun violence, and out of that grief, we have taken action. So far in 2019, we had 129 people who died in Washington, D.C. 8 were between the ages of 11 and 17, and majority of these deaths happened in the neighborhood in which we go to school and live.
Our current conversations about gun violence are guided by outdated research and ideas. How can we shift government funding away from policing and incarceration toward improved research and more effective programs that have a proven track record in reducing gun violence in cities like ours?
That's a good question.
That is the right question, and it contains a lot of pieces. Right now, we have this inhuman and inhumane criminal justice system that we all know is more centered on incarceration and punishment than it is rehabilitation. So one thing I would do, and this is not necessarily directly related to gun violence, but I just want to call it out, we should get rid of private prisons because having prisons with a profit motivation makes no sense. They actually benefit from recidivism and shoddy treatment of inmates. We should, so to answer your question more directly, it's like we should be investing resources instead of policing and incarceration on trying to rebuild these communities. And I talk about this $1,000 a month freedom dividend. This is not my idea. This was championed by Martin Luther King in 1967, and he said, you know, in order for us to have a human and humane economy, we need to have a guaranteed minimum income for all Americans. And this is what he was fighting for when he was assassinated in 1968. Instead of putting our public resources to work punishing and incarcerating and policing, we need to put those self-same resources into the families, into the communities. And one of the things I said to a group of black entrepreneurs is that, you know how you get more black entrepreneurship in urban areas and African-American areas around the country? Put more money into black consumers' hands. And then all of a sudden, you'll see these neighborhoods become very, very different and much more vibrant economically. You just need to put the money that we're currently spending. And this is something I'm passionate about. I was with a corrections officer, and he said to me flat out, and this is a corrections officer, mind you, he said, we should pay people to stay out of jail because it's so expensive when they're in jail. Like, we think we're somehow being smart by not investing in our people. We just end up paying a much higher and darker price on the back end because of the dysfunction that we are allowed to dominate so many of our families and communities. So that's what I'd say. All the resources you're talking about, like, certainly we need to put them into your communities directly, and then we need to treat gun violence like a public health crisis and study it accordingly and say, look, we know what some of these causes are. We actually know how to improve them and make them better.
You mentioned your child earlier. As I understand, you have two small children, right?
Yeah, 6 and 4.
6 and 4. I've got a 5 and a 2 3/4. You said something recently that caught my attention because, as I mentioned to this crowd earlier, my kindergartner had a lockdown drill within the first 10 days of school, and you know we were taken aback by it. You said, and I want to make sure I get this right. You said that you think the potential benefits from these kinds of shooting drills are not worth the anxiety and mistrust that they're creating in children. Do you think that we should end those drills?
I do. So when you look at a policy like this, and I was talking to parents and children who were very anxious, understandably, because they were being made to understand, it's like, why am I doing this drill? Because it's potentially, potentially the case that someone's going to enter my school with an intent to kill me and my classmates, and so we're undertaking these activities. And that child was anxious and questioning, and it gives rise to a real sense of uncertainty for that child. I mean, if you can't be secure in your own classroom and you're a child, then your entire sense of the world gets shaken. And so you have to take that very real impact that is near certain times the millions of school children in this country and add it to their parents, because the parents are obviously experiencing this as you are, Craig. And then I dug through the fact patterns and tried to figure out how many lives you could reasonably expect to be saved through kids having these active shooter drills to prepare. And I had a really hard time finding like a number that was above any kind of nominal amount, and even then I was speculating. Like, I actually went through the fact patterns and tried to figure out, okay, you have this certain debilitating depression, anxiety, trauma over millions of Americans. That's like a certain cost. And then you have like, maybe you might have like at the margins, like, someone get out of harm's way in some of these situations. But it turns out like this number over here on the right was very, very low, vanishingly low. So to me as a country, if you have that certain cost and a very uncertain speculative benefit, you have to give your kids a chance to go to school and not worry about getting shot, in my opinion. Let the adults worry about them getting shot and let the kids go to school.
Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Yang.